How's it going, everyone? Ben here from Augment Guitars, and today we're going to be wiring up the Tele Partscaster build. I think it's really fun to do the electronics. You can really make some cool combinations with the wiring that produce some pretty cool sounds. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before we fully dive into wiring everything up, let's review the final parts I chose for the build. For both pots, I decided to go with 250Ks as the wiring diagram I chose called for them. Normally, I would use 500Ks for HS and HSS configurations, but I decided to change it up a bit. These will be a bit darker sounding versus the 500K pots. I also swapped out the 250K CTS pot with a Dunlop Super Audio Taper pot. I've seen these around and I've always wanted to try them out. For the input jack, I decided to use a standard 1/4" jack with an electro socket jack plate. The hole was already drilled out for this style of jack plate, so no modifications were required. For the switch, I kept the standard Fender 3-way switch I mentioned in a previous episode. For the capacitor, I was going to try this Vitamin Q 0.047 microfarad cap, but it wasn't going to fit in the control cavity, unfortunately. I chose a smaller ceramic cap instead, which you will see later in the video. To wire everything up, we will need a few tools and supplies. I will be using some of this 22 AWG solid core wire. I bought it off Amazon and it comes in a few different colors. You will need some wire strippers, a pair of fine wire cutters, some 60/40 Rosen core solder, and a soldering iron to solder all the connections. Let's first start wiring up the input jack. We will be using two wires for this, the white wire for the hot output and the black wire for the ground. Using the wire strippers, remove about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch of the wire sheath. One thing I like to do is hook the wire around the input jack and pot lugs to ensure a strong mechanical connection. This can help prevent the wire from being knocked loose if the guitar takes a hard fall and the solder breaks free. It additionally makes it easier to solder as the wire stays crimped down to the lug. Now that everything's in place, let's solder these connections up. This Kester Pocket Pack solder is super handy and really helps you pinpoint where you want the solder to go. I like to set my soldering iron to a high setting as it helps melt the solder fast, which speeds up the wiring process. I finished both lugs and now I'm going to add some heat shrink tubing. I cut them to a length of about 1 inch. I slide the tubing up over the lug to prevent any of the leads from touching or grounding out. Using a lighter or a heat gun, heat up the tubing until it shrinks down. Move fast and be careful as you don't want to burn or melt the tubing. Now that the input jack is wired up, let's install it into the body. Using two small black pickguard screws, I fully seated and installed the electro socket jack plate. We are now ready to start the bulk of the wiring. On my iPad, I pulled up a wiring diagram from the Seymour Duncan website, which will be available in the description below. This diagram features a humbucker single coil layout, 1 volume, 1 tone push-pull coil split, and a 3-way switch. Before we start the rest of the wiring, let's mount the pots and switch to a control plate. I'm using an old plate for most of the wiring as I don't want to accidentally scratch up the brand new plate. We will mount it to the new plate after most of the wiring is completed. Everything is in place and mounted, so let's get to work. Off camera, I soldered up the ceramic cap to the middle lug of the tone pot. The other lead goes to the number 3 terminal. I like using these CTA push-pull pots because they are much easier to solder in connections versus the traditional mini toggle push-pull pots. You can see the layout of the traditional mini toggle above the open terminal holes. The number 3 lead then gets routed to the side of the pot where we will solder it to the ground. This wire is from the cap that I didn't trim. I then soldered a lead going from the right lug of the tone pot to the left lug of the volume pot. We will wait to solder the volume pot until we make another lead going to the 3-way switch. For all of these connections, I will be using heat shrink tubing for a nice clean look. Let's wire up the lead to the switch. I wired up the lead and added the heat shrink tubing to both wires. One thing I like about the solid core wire is that when you bend it, it will keep its form. This helps you keep the wire routing really clean. I routed the wire over to the switch and stripped off about 2 to 2.5 inches of the sheath. We will be fishing this exposed wire through the switch lugs detailed in our wiring diagram. This can be a bit tricky, so let me show you how I do it. I use these small, long, needle nose pliers to bend the tabs in a way that makes it easy to fish the wire through. I fish the wire through and then continue to bend the tabs until the wire is correctly fished through all of the required lugs. In the end, it should look like this. You can even go one step further and bend the tabs back for a stronger mechanical connection. Now that we have the wire placed where we want it, let's solder up the connections. When soldering, you want to use a decent amount of solder, but not too much. If you use too much, it can drip down the lug and into the switch mechanism. You also want to keep the movement to a minimum, as we don't want any bad or cold solder joints. I was moving a bit in this clip, but it was because the camera was blocking my view to get this shot. You will know when you have a good connection when the solder is shiny and doesn't have a matte appearance. Everything is soldered up, so let's cut off the excess wire hanging off the last lug. Since we made a few of the connections already, I decided to swap out the template with our new control plate. You can do this after you solder everything up, but I decided to just do it now before wiring in the pickups. We are now ready to connect everything together. Before we continue, let's put some towels down to protect the guitar from any soldering accidents, flyaways, or drips. With everything ready, let's start connecting the pickups. We will start by soldering in the neck pickup hot wire to the front right lug of the switch. You can also see that the wire sheath is the traditional cloth pushback. I use both the cloth pushback and plastic sheath wiring on my builds. It just depends on the look I want to go for. I really don't have a preference either way, as they both work great. The next step is to tackle the humbucker. This is where things can get a little bit more advanced, as we are wiring up a coil split. The pickup has 5 wires, which enables us to wire it for a bunch of different configurations. For bare knuckle pickups, the red wire is the north start, the green wire is the north finish, the black wire is the south start, the white wire is the south finish, and the bare wire is the ground. These colors are different for Seymour Duncan pickups, so we will need a conversion chart. There will be one in the links section below. This was from a different pickup, so let me show you how to strip back this insulated wire shielding. First, estimate the amount of wire length you'll need. Ensure that all wires will reach their connection points without putting too much strain on them. In this case, we need to go to the switch and the tone pot. Using a fresh razor blade, lightly cut the outer insulated sheath, ensuring not to cut into the 5 small wires that are inside. You will know when you are through when you see the reflective insulation. Pull off the outer sheath and separate all of the wires. Once again, remove around 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch of the outer wire sheath. We will start by wiring up the coil split. For this, we will be combining the green north finish and the white south finish wires together and then soldering them to the push-pull pot C2 terminal. We will wrap them together and solder the ends to make a strong connection. Before connecting them to the C2 terminal, we will once again add some heat shrink tubing. Once this is connected, we will connect the red north start wire to the switch's rear left lug. With all the connections completed, the last step is to connect all of the ground wires to the top of the volume pot. I like to solder most, if all of the ground connections, to one spot, as it helps prevent ground loops and is easier to troubleshoot ground issues if they arise. Before soldering up this connection, I like to take a bit of 220 grit sandpaper on the end of a pencil eraser to rough up the surface a bit. This helps the solder make a strong connection to the top of the pot. After prepping the surface, I changed my soldering iron's fine point tip to this large square-shaped one. This tip works great for applying large amounts of solder to a large surface. We will then lay down a pool of solder to make connecting all the various ground wires easier. With an alligator clip, I combined all the ground wires together and then soldered them. We will then apply a generous amount of solder to the tip. Using one of these soldering tools from StewMac, I position the ground wires on top of the initial solder pool and then solder the connections together. You can always go back and apply some more if you need it. I also soldered in the ground connection for the ceramic cap previously shown. One extra step I like to take is to use these small wire zip ties to clean up some of the excess wire. It helps to keep things neat and organized in the control cavity. As you can see, we still have a bit of wire left over from the humbucker. I always leave a bit of excess wire length, as if you want to swap out the pickups and sell the old one, you have plenty of wire left for the next guitar. Now that the wiring is completed, let's position the plate to ensure everything fits. Ensure that none of the wires are being sandwiched between the plate and the body. Before we fully install the control plate, let's test out the pickups to ensure everything is wired correctly. Connect the guitar to an amp and turn the volume up a bit. Start by switching to the bridge pickup and turn the volume and tone knobs all the way up. Using a small screwdriver, touch the lugs of the pickup to ensure we are getting sound from the desired pickup and switch position. As you can hear, our switch is wired up correctly. Let's test out the coil split now. As you can hear, the bridge coil is on, and the noise from the other coil is coming from the magnetic force of the screwdriver hitting the pickup, not the lugs themselves. When switching to the middle position, the humbucker still retains its split coil. Also, ensure to check the volume and tone knobs to make sure they are working too. After ensuring all the wiring is correct, let's mount the control plate to the body. Once again, make sure none of the wires are sandwiched between the plate and the body. The last step is to install the switch tip and control knobs. The switch tip simply pushes on and is held by friction. The control knobs are held on by a small set screw, which ensures the knob doesn't move and stays put. When installing them, I like to leave a small bit of space between the plate and the knob to ensure it doesn't catch and scratch the plate. I also like to install them with the set screw facing down, as you can't see them while you're playing. A quick test shows that the switch and knobs can be easily adjusted. And that just about wraps up this episode. I really can't wait to test out these pickups. I bet they're going to sound great. And then having the option to coil split too really just opens up the capabilities and tones you can get for it. That's why I really like adding them to my builds. So if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the Augment Guitars YouTube channel. In the next episode, we're going to be installing the nut, fine-tuning it, and giving the guitar a complete setup. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.